So this sort of inversion of values becomes a central theme that um nature works through. I mean, he begins working through this already in Daybreak, written just before Genealogy of Morals, which is our main. We're reading the first essay. You are reading the first essay from Genealogy of Morals. Themes that also show up in Beyond Good and Evil and in Human, All Too Human. But by and large, it's in these texts we're getting sort of this well fleshed out view of what he means by this inversion of values. So he starts by noting that moral terms begin with the emergence of class distinctions or social distinctions between the ruling groups and the ruled groups, and that in the earlier ages, it was the qualities of the ruling groups that would, the aristocrats, for example, or the rulers, or the nobility, it was their qualities that were regarded as morally positive. Terms like noble, strong, virtuous, happy, pleasing, these are terms used to describe the ruling class. By contrast, the attributes of the ruled, the people who were ruled, uh, were thought of as exhibiting lesser or baser, lower, sort of cruder values. So what you get is a sort of sliding scale of good at one end and bad at the other end. Good was more courage, bad was less courage. Good was, you know, uh, sort of more nobility, stronger versus weaker, and so on. But as you can see, they're on a sliding scale from, sort of a higher ranking to lower ranking, and so on. So that this distinction of good and bad appears. And good being associated with the qualities of the ruling class: brave, courageous, strong, noble, and so on, and the bad being less brave, so cowardly, or less strong, weaker, less powerful, sort of meeker or helpless, uh, less wealthy, poorer. So you get this more or less of something. Now, these values of good on the higher end and bad on the lower end of this sliding scale, these ruling values are first threatened, Nietzsche argues, from within the aristocratic class itself. In other words, by the priestly class in traditional feudal society made up of the second sons and third sons. The eldest son inherits the nobility's title and lands and so on. Second son goes off to join the church and so on. But generally speaking, this priestly class, who no longer, reflect or represent those, highly esteemed warrior values, strength, nobility, and so on. So they are the ones who transform this prevailing set of ruling class attributes as good. They replace them with values that are more in accord with their own sort of bureaucratic, religious, civil functions: cunning and ruse and intelligence. You know, replace valor and courage and strength. So he says the first transition happens within the ruling class itself. That those within the ruling class, and here he attributes it to the priestly caste within the ruling class, who don't have these warrior-like values, strength, nobility, uh, power, and so on. They're more helpless, and so on. So it's their values. They start sort of ranking higher: cunning, working behind the scene, intelligence, ruse, intrigue, talking, doing, something that you can't attain by strength. You attain by maybe spreading gossip, spreading rumor, finding other ways to bring down your strong opponent who you're otherwise not capable of, say, facing face to face. He's kind of getting at these kinds of primal, struggle here between the strong and the, their weaker brothers or cousins. And this is, leads us to Nietzsche's main concern. He'll argue that this is already pointing to an immense sort of reservoir, this immense sort of bottled up resentment of the weaker towards the more powerful. And he says this immense reservoir of resentment is already found in early Christian morality, where he'll talk about how the weak replace the morality of the powerful or the ruling class with their own morality. This is what he refers to as the so called slave revolt in morality. That, according to Nietzsche, the most significant transformation of values is this moment of completely overturning that earlier set of sort of so called aristocratic or higher values. He'll use this term, we'll come to it later, or a complete reversal of those. This, quote, inversion of values marks the transition for Nietzsche from classical Greek and Roman aristocratic morality to Christian and later utilitarian, egalitarian, Kantian, etc. value systems. Now, Nietzsche calls this slave revolt in morals a form of resentiment. We'll see what this means, resentiment. But basically, what this slave revolt comprises is replacing those earlier aristocratic scales of values with those of the so called underclass, the weaker, the meeker, the slaves. So now he's sort of, moving a little bit terminology wise, so that, and if this will remain even when slavery comes to an end, and he'll show that this slave morality remains. So from ruling and versus ruled, we are moving to sort of this master versus slave morality. That the slave revolt consists in replacing the master scale of values with those of the underclass or the values of the slaves. So, from this standpoint, something very interesting will happen. This is why we will talk about a notion of resentiment, not just resentment. Uh, and we'll talk about not just how should we say it, a transfer of values from the aristocratic to the slave, just reversing it, but something what he'll refer to as a transvaluation of values. Even what is valuable will change. So, just to give you a sense, and we'll build on this, is from this standpoint, what aristocratic or master morality valued as good, strength, power, courage, and so on, now becomes inverted and devalued into not bad, evil. So, this is what I mean. It's not simply a question of the slave or the ruled population's values just simply replacing the rulers or the masters' values. That what was good for the masters now becomes bad, and what was bad for the masters in the master's scale now becomes good. No, what he's saying is what was good for the masters now becomes not bad in the slave morality, but becomes evil. And what was formerly bad in the aristocratic morality, weakness, passivity, being timid, helpless, powerless, now becomes good. So the formerly bad becomes good, but the formerly good does not become bad, it becomes evil. Strength and power and courage, all of that now become aggression and belligerence, out of control behavior, and so on. We're used to these terms. He's getting us to think about terms we're used to, and so on. So just if you look at this brief chart I made, you get a sense that in the aristocratic or the ruling classes or the master value system, value scale, you had a scale of good to bad. You can move up and down this line. If you're right in the middle, it would seem it's like half good, half bad, so neutral or average. The more you move towards the left hand side, towards good, it becomes better and better and better. And the more you move towards the bad to the right hand side of this line, it becomes lesser or less good or lower, baser, cruder. But they're still on the same scale. Courage and cowardice. The more you move towards the left, it becomes more and more courageous. More you move towards the right, it becomes less and less courageous. That's bad. But now that has been transvalued into good and evil. Now, good and evil are not on a sliding scale, they're opposites, they're antithetical to each other. A good is not less evil, or evil is not less good. They're opposites. So here you can see they lie on two sides of that line. So in the aristocratic or ruling morality, what you had was a scale of higher qualities and lower qualities, more of something and less of something. But now, what was previously bad, the lower part, has been turned into good, and what was previously good has been turned into evil, the opposite of good. They are no longer on a scale. So they're truly antithetical. So it's a transvaluation of values that have taken place. Values moved away from the scale of more or less to these values as opposites of each other. So the values of the ruling class and the ruled, or the aristocrats, or the masters and the slaves, are now opposites rather than more or less of each. Let's play this out more. So, what you get is the transition from the aristocratic good to the slave morality is evil. That is the key to the slave revolt. And what is represented or reflected in this inversion and complete devaluation of the aristocratic good, according to Nietzsche, is that this evil, that it doesn't simply, what was aristocratic good does not simply become bad in slave revolt, because what it reflects, instead of becoming bad, the fact that it becomes evil, the opposite of the values of the slaves, or the ruled class, or the working class, the lower classes of society, in this viewpoint, uh, is that there is an enormous upswelling of long repressed bitterness, that is bred from the fact that from the helplessness or the lack of power and the suffering and the impotence in terms of power of the people who are ruled, or the slave class. Even if they actually formally don't, no longer are slaves. The origin of this lies in the context where you had, slaves and masters. But even after the institutions of slavery are gone, he is saying that you have this tremendous sort of wellspring of bitterness, of having long suffered under these masters, and yet impotent or powerless to overthrow those masters. So it can only find satisfaction and expression in this revolt against the master. Which then brings us to the next sort of key point, where this why this bitterness, and why this sort of transvaluation that takes place. Why not simply resentment at someone who's harming you, but this resentiment? You're completely sort of reevaluating what they are all about. Is that it's not necessarily a political or military overthrow. Nietzsche refers to it sort of like a psychomoral victory, a substitute for real action that leads to this revaluation of values. Because by definition, the slaves, and now we'll go into a critique of uh, Nietzsche, of course, particularly his sort of sort of extolling and playing up these so-called aristocratic values, both for the sort of primitive nature of some of those values and the belligerent nature of some of those values, and also for his inability to really fundamentally understand, I will argue later, in the notions of sort of democratic revolt and so on. But we bracket all of that now, just to get a sense where he's coming from. That according to him, it's not like the slaves actually politically or militarily overthrow the masters. They're still helpless in power. So what they're doing is accomplishing a psychological victory, in their heads. That's what Christianity will do for them, that turning them into evil rather than simply bad now. This is a psychomoral victory, often in the absence of an actual physical or political or military victory over the uh, ruling classes. And what sort of psychomoral victory is this? Nietzsche goes on to show that the slave is induced into sort of, on the one hand, as I mentioned, positively embrace these inverted values, but this is done through the promise of a deferred compensation. What do we mean by this? What we mean by this is that in this living world, in this earthly world, they're still the slaves or the lower classes or the people who are ruled or in poverty, still suffering, while those the aristocrats or the rich and the powerful continue to enjoy their wealth and privilege and so on. But in this new morality, all that those rich and powerful are doing are now seen as evil. And they will suffer for that evil not in this life, but in the next life. In this life, we may not be able to physically overthrow them and so on. This is where this transvaluation is going on. And what the slave or the weak and the meek and the poor is promised is this positive afterlife in heaven, that the meek shall inherit the earth, as it says in Christian doctrine, that those who are now poor, now suffering, and all. Even if we can't overcome these conditions of suffering and overcome and overthrow the rich and the powerful, it's in the next life. This rich and the powerful, now you see why the evil part comes in. By virtue of the fact that they are evil, that all they do is the opposite of the values that are now thought of as good: being meek, being humble, keeping one's place in society, not being aggressive and violent, and so on. These will be rewarded in the next life. And the rich and powerful, who are the cause of everybody, so many people suffering, they will suffer in the next life. So, the promise of heaven for the true believers who suffer in this world from the evil overlord, and the overlord, by nature of his now valued morality of the slave system, the Christian system, where now this evil, the overlord and the rich and powerful, now exhibit the qualities of not bad, evil. They will end up in hell. And the agent of this promise, if you haven't already gathered by now, is this otherwise powerless intriguer and cunning manipulator of human sufferings, the priest. So therefore, the priestly class, garners both moral sort of compliance and practical support of the lower classes, and seeks the political subjugation of the ruling classes now. Now the priests start, the Catholic Church and so on, start exerting power over these ruling classes. So let's spend a little time on this